Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. Welcome to this webinar on Building Back Ukraine Better. My name is Ellen de Vibe. I'm the Deputy Head of the NGO Habitat Norway. It's a voluntary organization that works with global settlement challenges. We do different things. We have events like this. We write articles, give out books or leaflets, and participate in the Norwegian debate about development tasks. We know that the situation in Ukraine is very severe at the moment. And then how may we imagine a future where the war destruction may foster a sustainable development in the sustainable reconstruction of Ukraine? This webinar is one of 3 this autumn. Today we will talk about existing conditions and situation in Ukraine. In the autumn we will talk about the city, the dwellings and the property rights of Ukraine. And then later at the end of the year we will talk about planning processes and tools that are available to develop Ukraine. This is a hybrid event, both digitally and physically. I will signal in some way, I'm not quite sure how we do it digitally, to the speakers when we have reached about 17 minutes for each presentation. And at the moment, it's a great pleasure for me to convey to you that we are grateful for the cooperation with Tekna arranging this event. Tekna is the Association of Graduate Technical and Scientific Professionals in Norway. And to open the webinar, it's a pleasure for me first to invite Diana Høen, who is the chair of Habitat Norway, and immediately afterwards the president of Tekna, Elisabeth Haugsbø, to open this webinar. Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ellen, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, both those of you who are here in the room and online. My name is Diana Høen, and it's a great pleasure as the chair of Habitat Norway to co-host this event together with Tekna. I'll allow myself to reiterate some of the thanks that Ellen just mentioned, but really thank you so much to the team here for all of your efforts. An extra warm welcome to our distinguished speakers from UN Habitat, the World Bank, NORAD, and of course, the representative from Norwegian and Ukrainian civil society and higher education that will engage in insightful perspectives during the panel discussion later in our program. I would also like to extend gratitude to my colleagues at Habitat Norway, who I know have pulled many strings leading up to today's event. It has been a fruitful collaboration so far, and Habitat Norway are looking forward to the coming events this autumn as we continue to shed light on the construction efforts in Ukraine and civil society's role in it. As Ellen mentioned, as an NGO, Habitat Norway has for more than 20 years worked to promote human settlements and urbanization issues, both in Norway and around the world. We are a thematic branch of the Norwegian Housing and City Planning Association, known as Bygge. So feel free to direct any questions you may have about our work and ongoing projects to me or my colleagues. Before I hand over the word over to Elisabeth, I'd like to underscore how important civil society's role can have in providing critical context as the future in Ukraine and the outcomes of the war remain elusive. What we do know, though, and which marks the point of departure for us today, is that reconstruction in Ukraine will involve the rebuilding of economic and social infrastructure, but also the entire built environment, cities and towns that are now in ruin. But building back better goes beyond providing the just so-called brick and mortar. It's also about rebuilding new communities in a country that will never be the same after this war one day will come to an end, and where 6 million people now have been internally displaced, many millions more have fled, many of whom might never return. To illustrate, the advocacy role civil society was recently exemplified by a CSO coalition at the G7 meetings between foreign ministers in Japan. The coalition urged international donors to allocate funding directly to municipalities in order to implement local reconstruction initiatives, since only a very small portion of global funds reach the local level. The coalition, which consists of CEE Bankwatch, International Center for Ukrainian Energy, among others, also stressed the need to stop Russian fossil fuel imports, close sanction loopholes, and support building Ukraine with cleaner energy solutions. To this end, I look forward to hear more about the presentation of Norod's new funding scheme directed towards civil society. This shows how the opportunities provided by Norwegian development aid remain paramount, especially because we are well aware that key lessons from Ukraine over time will become instructive, as we must also begin looking towards the need for support in rebuilding and reconstructing other parts of the world. Of course, places like Gaza, Sudan, Haiti come to mind. But for now, I look forward to the rest of our program and upcoming discussion. So thank you once again for your time, and over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you for your introduction, Diana. Joining forces here today means a lot. Habitat Norway is an important actor working on global urban challenges and sustainable development. I'm therefore very happy to be collaborating on putting reconstruction of Ukraine here today on the agenda. Tekna is engaged in international issues both as a trade union, but also through professional initiatives and other networks. Tekna has supported our Ukraine trade union colleagues internationally, both economically and politically. We are happy that several of them have been embraced as members of Industrial All Europe. Within the international organization, we look forward to collaborating and utilizing their resources to secure workers' rights, both in Ukraine and Europe as a whole. Furthermore, Tekna's members have a high-level experience in civil constructions and civil infrastructure. And I highly encourage all our members to contribute with their technical expertise where they can. Building a country requires multidisciplinary competence and collaboration. Ukraine will face a monumental task in rebuilding the country following the war. Construction workers will meet hazards as asbestos, landmines, and other explosive materials. Proper skills and training will be crucial. To lay the foundation for a resilient future, Ukraine should focus on rebuilding its physical infrastructure with a green and competitive edge. This requires both knowledge exchange and major capital contributions. Investing in technology and sustainable solutions will give Ukraine a future-ready infrastructure that can withstand the test of time. We should work together as actors across our countries to rebuild Ukraine the best way possible. And I'm very pleased that we have many engaging speakers here today for this seminar. And I would like to give a special thanks to Tekna Samfunnsviterne for contributing with expertise, network, and international commitment. Thanks to everyone who has contributed in the events committee, and I appreciate that the topic is being raised here today. And I'm glad that this is just one of several webinars coming. Even if the end of the war feels very distant sometimes, I believe that we can make a difference. Individual actions are good, but together we can definitely accomplish more. So I wish everyone a great webinar here today, and all of you who are actually here physically. And yeah, let's build Ukraine back better together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana and Elizabeth. Then we'll get into the real program of this afternoon. Philippe de Court is working for the UN Habitat Human Settlements Program. He is Emergency Response Director. He has focused on urban initiatives in conflict and crisis influenced countries related to urban planning, land use, and housing policies. He has worked in Haiti, Palestine, Somalia, and Morocco. And we are very much looking forward to hear him talk, and I'm particularly interested in how does mobilization of civic organizations make it crucial for a successful reconstruction? How is it crucial to mobilize them? So let's hope the connection to Philippe de Court is there.
Thanks a lot. Can you just confirm you can hear me? Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Okay. Now, thanks a lot for the invites. I'll focus on a couple of aspects of urban recovery, which I believe maybe need more attention, including this kind of discussions. The loss of home and take into account pre-war realities. And to start with, I would like to invite you to have a close look at the picture on the left. And I give you a couple of seconds to kind of note down almost mentally a couple of things that come to your mind in looking at the picture. I assume all of us, of course, the first thing comes to mind is we see the impact of war. Secondly, on my side, I'm trained as an architect and a planner. I see apartments, I see homes ripped apart. And thirdly, of course, as an engineer, I see substandard construction, which is, of course, the case of most of the housing stock in Ukraine, which will be important to consider as we try to build back better. I do very much like the text that was put forward by the organizers, focusing not just on the physical, also the economic and the social, focusing on the number and the large number of people that have been displaced, but also very importantly on this last concept. It's not just about building back buildings, but also building back new communities. Oh, sorry. This is a zoom in on one of the demolished buildings. And you wonder what the fireman is doing up there. What is he trying to rescue from a building that clearly has been heavily demolished? They proudly descend and they're holding one specific object. It's too small to see probably on your screen, but this is the object. It's a rooster, and some of you might remember, the pictures are from Borodyanka, one of the hromadas north of Kiev, which were heavily damaged exactly in the attempt to invade Kiev and the besiege of Kiev that lasted quite a while. It became an object of resistance, but the object was found almost hanging off the side of the building and was rescued. For me, it's a clear reminder exactly, this is not just a demolished building, but also the loss of a home, the loss of a place for a family that had its dear objects on the cupboard, and also, of course, that resemble much more than just damage of a building and loss of a house, but loss of a place, of a family, loss of home. It's something that we will take forward also at the next World Urban Forum in Cairo in a high-level dialogue. But I would encourage all of you also to reflect on this more, because this is not something we assess. It's not something we're able to understand properly in the way we look at damage for the moment. But it's something that's been critical when we look at rebuilding. specifically also because it influences how families take decisions. How will they try to regain that notion of home, and what will be important to them in doing so? I'll zoom out a bit. These are the several maps of the impact and the status of the war when the World Bank, the EU, and the UN did their rapid damage assessments. As you can see, heavily in the east, around Kiev, and slowly also impacting other areas in what is a vast country. A couple of other elements, and I'm not trying to steal the presentation of Susanna, but just maybe the World Bank coming after me, but just reflecting on a couple of things, again, that we need to consider carefully as we think about the damage and rebuilding. This is a picture of the three assessments that are done, and just pointing to, in a way, relatively low level of damage on housing compared to other sectors, but also the increasing focus on productive sectors, both important, of course, for cities overall, energy and so forth, but also impact on transport and industry, the functioning of the country overall. And just as a comparison, we just had the damage assessment also again by the World Bank, EU, and the UN done for the Gaza Strip. In the case of Ukraine, housing is 10% of the housing stock has been affected, representing a smaller part of the overall damage compared to Gaza. In Gaza, we're up to 62% of the housing stock and 72% of the overall damage, representing the housing sector. So clearly a completely different war. And these are not just numbers, but I think they should influence the way we think about the war and the impact in Ukraine and the options for recovery and reconstruction. As I said from the beginning, important also for us to consider the notion of the pre-war dynamics. This is a graph of the population dynamics in Ukraine. We see that since the independence, exactly when at the height we had 52 million, we had seen already a gradual decline of the population in Ukraine, of course, accelerated by the war. But we've also seen a not unsubstantial return of Ukrainians in the last year or so. Very important to understand what made people return, what were the decision makings. And again, for a lot of these questions, there are no answers, but I do believe they're going to be very important for us to understand properly so that we can actually craft a proper way or have a good sense building back better for who and how. Again, a quick comparison with the Gaza Strip. For Ukraine, we talk about 13% of the population that has been displaced, with 10% of the housing stock. If you do a little bit of the maths and look into the assessments more in detail, you can see that a lot of people in Ukraine fled not because of their house was demolished, but exactly for other reasons, for security reasons and for the loss of access to livelihoods. So important again to note the difference. Well, for the Gaza Strip, of course, people can't flee, but are internally displaced. We talk about 75% of the population with 62% of the housing stock damaged. So even if we would, there would be an option to return to what? Much more difficult in the context of the Gaza Strip. In the context of Ukraine, mostly around safety, of course, and security, but then infrastructure and economy are critical. Well, of course, the housing stock is still an issue, but not as much as in the context of the Gaza Strip. Now, the World Bank did quite an important study on urbanization in Ukraine in 2015. I'm showing the overall map, and then basically the urbanization trends. So urbanization, in a way, continues to slightly increase, but there's an overall decline of population in 80% of the cities. You can see that pre-war, there was already quite a movement from the east to the west, now accelerated by the war and displacement, where most people have sought refuge in exactly the cities in the east, Lviv being amongst the primary one amongst them. But important to understand exactly the reasons and the drivers behind these shifts of populations of course, which have a lot to do with economy. And of course, the broader decline in population, which we showed before, of course, show the trend towards Europe. Now, zooming in back to Borodyanka. Borodyanka, and if you can see my arrow, is somewhere here in the northeast of Kiev, still considered within the influence sphere, the spatial influence of Kiev. But the picture you see is of Bucha. Bucha is a similar small hromada closer to Kiev, which had seen, and the numbers show it below, quite a boom before the war. It has de facto become, from a very small village, the suburb of Kiev. It is also the one that was quite a lot in the news because of the atrocities that happened in Bucha. But you can see there, of course, that this is not a village. This already was a suburb of Kiev, and actively so. Borodyanka, being on the extreme edge, it basically still, as you saw in the pictures, very much a couple of Soviet buildings, but never saw the kind of increase in investment in housing that happened before the war in Bucha. So a completely different situation, very close to each other, but in a way damaged in similar ways by the war. Now we come to the projection of building back better. These are plans being made for Borodyanka, which, as I pointed out, exactly in the extreme, on the edge of the influence of Kiev. No real influence today, but hope and potential. Hope and potential projected here onto the reconstruction in Borodyanka by a team of local officials and a team of international architects. Now, this is something we'll come back to a little bit later. But you can see, and if you talk to the government in Ukraine, we had long discussions with the Deputy Minister of Reconstruction. Of course, this projection of ideas onto cities has to be dealt with very carefully. Is this the building back better that is possible in Borodyanka? Projecting an airport, of course, is something, or an agro-technical park is something that really has to be seen within a broader territorial context, really understanding much better the dynamics and the potentials of a broader territory. For us, this is sometimes a little bit dangerous in the way that, of course, that it's raising the hope for a population that until now had seen only economic decline. Evidently, finding economic lifeline or a new lifeline for Borodyanka is important, but very important we have a very careful discussion on what is realistic and how to go about, again, if the starting point is building back communities, having people return to the extent possible, and then see exactly how to move beyond there. Rebuilding communities is the first step, jointly, of course, with accessing new livelihoods. But we wonder if this kind of projections are actually useful for the discussion on building back better in Ukraine. Now, evidently, the bigger question is where can Ukraine learn from? Ukraine is on a very long road to accession to the European Union. We do believe it's very important to have a closer look at the transition countries that also had been affected in the past by the Second World War. And then, of course, have been, let's say, their current development is very much defined by being in the Soviet infosphere for most of them. For the last World Urban Forum, for those who were there, took place in Katowice in Poland. A city, a smaller city that's completely reinvented itself. First had the scars of the war, then two had the scars, I would say, of quite the drastic reconstruction that didn't fully take into account building back communities and building back neighborhoods. And now it has reinvented itself and has become the back end of the gaming industry and is now full of young people. For those who are in Ukraine, sorry, in Katowice for the last World Urban Forum, a very dynamic and lively city. So the message is also here, let's not just look at reconstruction, but also successful efforts of regeneration. A couple of other examples maybe to think of is Sarajevo, heavily damaged during the war, 60% of the building stock. Very difficult reconstruction process because of the social dynamics, a completely social, different population after, so rebuilding communities, rebuilding neighborhoods, but for a different community. So this is also something important to consider. In Sarajevo, massive input of international expertise, but as far as I can see and I can read, overlooking exactly what it would take for the young people to come back, to create a city attractive to the young that had fled, or for the next generation to consider coming back to Sarajevo. So particularly important to look at this not just from a family perspective, but also from the perspective of the next generation. The downtown Beirut is a completely different experience, but I brought it here because for those who know it, downtown Beirut was completely redeveloped as a real estate project. None of the original souk owners have found their way back into the neighborhood, but it's private sector led. In a context like Ukraine, where the private sector will play a very important role, we have the need for a redevelopment in most of the cities, and quite important redevelopment. Very difficult now to think through, and very important to think through how the private sector can play a meaningful role, both balancing regeneration, but also, of course, rebuilding communities and allowing people to return to something they know and they want to live in. I'll say a couple of things about some of the broader thinking in UN Habitat. We find it important to really kind of develop what we call an urban recovery framework. I'll be traveling to Ukraine in 2 weeks' time to work on this with my team, UN Habitat team in Kiev, but also with the different stakeholders. It's really about making sure we develop an institutional and policy framework that allows that bottom-up recovery driven by cities that can work very closely with communities. At the end, it also both guides urban recovery at that local level, really constructed around the local needs and the needs of the communities and their desires, but also, of course, use it to rebuild the social contract between communities and government. Some of the key questions we ask ourselves in developing such a recovery framework: exactly how does it connect with the top-down instruments that is currently the focus, and how do you combine national government, local government, and of course, the question was asked also bring in that process the different other stakeholders, and specifically civil society. Two, important also to address the policy gaps and adjusting their planning systems. We know in Ukraine, you have quite a complex set of planning systems that are not fully operational. How do you make sure we have planning systems in place that are nimble enough to respond to the current needs and address the policy gaps where we require them? And a lot of them will be around exactly guiding, building back better when we talk about green infrastructure and more sustainable redevelopment. It has to facilitate local coordination, again, society-wide. It has to attract different kinds of financing instruments that incentivize better building back better. And of course, it has to kind of connect from the how, what we can do now, to the longer term. For us, this is important. Our motto is, let's try to support return and recovery wherever and whenever we can. It helps to sustain populations. It helps with the possible return whenever and wherever possible, but it has to build to something longer. So every opportunity of return and recovery today, rebuilding a neighborhood, is an opportunity to demonstrate what the future can look like. I won't get into much more detail, but our approach on urban recovery you can find online. Very important, of course, to have a real good understanding of the impact of the war in its different aspects, not just the physical aspects, but as I said, also the social aspects. We will do this in Ukraine, developing city profiles. We've done it in a lot of other conflict environments, Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and so forth. It also then becomes a very important instrument to communicate more clearly on the local urban dynamics and how that can feed into coordination, but also then support. Now, for us, again, once we move forward into recovery, one is aggregating damages as we do in the RDNAs, but then really also important to engage communities in that conversation on the damage, getting into the detail of it, understanding what is important for a community in a particular place, and using it as a basis also then to think about building back better. So very localized, and then we get into much more detailed community-based recovery plans, looking at the city as a whole, but then again, breaking it down to neighborhoods and have almost neighborhood-based action plans driven by communities. This is our experience of Syria, and something we hope also to help promote within the context of Ukraine. Back to our rooster. Just to point out exactly, we started with the loss of home. It is about adequate housing. Adequate housing, as you know, has 7 dimensions to it, not just about the quality of the building, but also the design and its location. Location that helps define access to services, access to livelihoods. Now for us, very important that the loss of home and its focus on communities connects back to a neighborhood-based approach. It's something we are now trying to promote also in the Gaza Strip, having a neighborhood lens onto damages, because it's easier then to connect exactly with the social aspects of the impact of a war and thinking through rebuilding, return, and rebuilding communities or new communities where needed. We won't get into the detail, but an approach to sustainable neighborhoods that brings all the key dimensions of sustainability together and looks at it across the key aspects of a neighborhood, from the neighborhood down to the streets, the public space, and the building units. Coming towards the end, a couple of principles for us important in our Ukraine recovery framework. Again, important if you look at damage, understanding the impact on place, but on people. 2, making sure that urban recovery planning is supported by initiatives led by Ukrainian authorities and communities. Also in support of decentralization, which was very strong before the war. There's always a risk during a war, and in the response of a re-centralization, and that risk in Ukraine is quite real. Importance of strengthening approaches and capacities in Ukraine, and exactly thinking around the sustainable neighborhoods and communities. Now, how do we do that? And just to give a couple of examples. 1, we are setting up a Kiev urban lab, a planning lab that will help support planning and recovery activities. It's a collaboration. It's not a Gjenoppbygging lab. It's a collaboration with Restart and Roskvit, 2 Ukrainian-based associations in civil society, bringing together urban planners and architects and other professions in Ukraine, for them to help with us shape the appropriate approaches, and also making sure we kind of have an ongoing knowledge sharing across to understand better and learn what building back better means in specific localities, and kind of feed it back up into policy making to address policy gaps based on practice. Also, that feedback loop, exactly with concrete experience at the local level, will be critical, but also the longer term capacity building. There is no school of urban planning and design in Ukraine. We're working very closely with the School of Architecture in Kharkiv and others. There's an intent exactly in the desire to make sure that in this process we drive building back better by Ukrainian architects and engineers and planners. Let them lead with our support, but we also make sure that in the process we build a longer term capacity, which this will be necessary in all the cities in Ukraine, to make sure again that this will be a locally led process, building on Ukrainian capacity and expertise. Now, just the last 2 slides. We do think it will be important to kind of make a state of the Ukrainian cities report, to really connect back with that pre-war dynamic and to project into the future. So not just looking at damage and reconstruction, but actually looking at urbanization as a longer term process in Ukraine, which now got a big step back, but at the same time, it's very clear that there's the ambition for a completely different future, looking towards Europe and the experiences there. I'll end with a slide with the tech the organizers had put forward. And just to add exactly that, yes, it's about rebuilding, but also look at it from the perspective of territorial and urban regeneration. Yes, it's about those displays, but we'll have to understand carefully who is willing to return and under what conditions, and what quality of life they will be looking for, and what are going to be the incentives for them to do so. And of course, building new communities, but also let's make sure we connect it with the built environment, building new neighborhoods. Allow me to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. I think both your dimensions about short-term, medium-term and long-term framework for what is happening is good. And of course, the last bit you talked about with the Kiev Urban Lab sounds very exciting. Okay, Now we are going to meet two representatives from the World Bank, Susanna Stanton-Geddes and Thomas Farrell. They will speak together, but Susanna will lead the presentation, I gather. Susanna is a disaster risk management specialist. She's worked in Europe and Central Asia. She has focused on resilience, infrastructure, flood and post-disaster recovery. And she has, I think, up to 3 different degrees. Thomas is the lead economist in the World Bank on Sustainable Development Practice Group. And they have together worked on the damage reports. The third one has come not long ago. And with your overview of the situation in Ukraine after 2 years of war, I think it will be very interesting to hear what you have to tell us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ellen and colleagues. Thank you very much for the invitation. I can send that on behalf of all our colleagues from the World Bank that are joining today. Indeed, we are very happy to provide you with a presentation on the results from the third rapid damage and needs assessment. As a way of introduction, this is a joint assessment that was done by the government of Ukraine, the World Bank, the European Commission, and UN agencies. We've heard that already from Philippe. Thank you for the references. I wanted to first start with a few slides also on the context. I'll provide you also with the results of the damages and needs, and then my colleague Tom will come in on the specific 2024 priorities. So the objective of this assessment of the RDNA-3 was to conduct a rapid yet consistent and robust assessment across all of the sectors in Ukraine and the whole country as affected. This is a similar objective that was held for also RDNA-1 and RDNA-2. Now, the RDNA-1, the first assessment, looked at the first 3 months of the war. The second assessment looked at the first year, so 12 months of the war. And the third assessment that indeed was launched just recently in February looked at 22 months, so almost 2 years of the war. Despite the assessment built on the results of the previous assessments, and we benefited also from new data, there are some limitations that we continued to have also under this assessment, including certain data sensitivity and, of course, not being able to access information from areas that were not under government control. On this slide, you also see a number of other pictures from different assessments and reports that have also been produced in the past years or months that also form a valuable contribution to the whole discussion. So let's start with some of the context. It was already mentioned in the previous keynote. The war indeed continues to take a severe human, social, economic toll. Here are just some key figures. Some of them were already mentioned. 5.9 million people were displaced across Europe, while 3.7 million displaced internally. This is data from December 2023. The high number of civilian deaths, the impact on poverty, food insecurity in particular, and also specific impacts on vulnerable groups, including women, persons with disabilities, youth and children, IDPs, the elderly, etc. And overall, the war has also wide-ranging impacts on the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this slide presents the key results from this rapid damage and needs assessment. The big figure that you might have seen in the media includes is the 152 billion in direct damage. This refers to the physical damages to assets, to buildings, to infrastructure. And then on the other side is 486 billion of recovery reconstruction needs. These are much higher than the damages because they consider indeed the building back better. So meaning the inclusion of improved standards, of improved materials, etc. So this is why the number is so much bigger. On this slide, I've also included a quick comparison between the previous assessments and this assessment. So here you see the direct damage. Yellow is the first assessment, the light blue is the second, and the dark blue is the third one. And also on the other side of the reconstruction and recovery needs. So you can see that actually looking at the damage, the increase from the light blue to the dark blue, so from the second RDNA, which looked at 1 year, vis-a-vis the second one is not as dramatic. And I'll come back to this a bit later. Now, let's look a little bit also at the damages per sector. Here is a slide figure showing you basically that the war has caused high damage across all sectors. So highest, in fact, are recorded in the social infrastructure. They are in blue, followed by infrastructure here in orange, and then productive sectors as well as other sectors. Housing sector already came up. It remains the most impacted sector with 37% of the total damage. And also the point of 10% of the total housing stock that has been damaged and destroyed was already mentioned. So that is really indeed a tremendous substantial impact. Transport is another highly impacted sector, which makes up about 22% of the total damage, followed by commerce and industry, so indeed productive sectors, as well as, say, the energy and extractive sector. This slide shows you the damages in terms of the spatial impact. The damage in the last assessment continues to be concentrated in the same regions as before. And you have regions with highest damage, including Donetska, Kharkivska, Luhanska, Zaporizhska, Khersonska, and Kievska Oblast. And now also Kievska, Zaporizhska, and Khersonska Oblast have crossed 11 billion in damages line. Here is a image that you've already seen, so I can go through it very quickly. It is a summary of the spatial evolution and also trajectory of the war in terms of the high intensity of the war in the early months, followed also by regaining of control in certain areas, and then also the intensive fights in specific areas. Kakhovka Dam destruction has, of course, impacted quite severely and has been reflected in the RDNA free results, as well as attacks in Odessa and in Mykolaievska regions as well. Here's a little bit more detail in terms of damage when we look at specific sectors. As I mentioned, the third RDNA didn't record substantial change for some sectors for several reasons, but for others they were more prominent. So the Kakhovka Dam certainly has contributed to the increase in damage in, say, agriculture, in environment, natural resources and forestry, but also irrigation, water supply, sanitation, and housing. The attacks on cultural heritage, for example, in Odessa, are reflected quite well in an increase. There has been also cyber attacks, etc. So some of these are reflected. In other areas, we had improved the data and estimation. So there were some adjustments, and in some cases, we had small reclassification. Now, this is a similar figure to what I showed you for damage now for needs, and total needs remain. Total needs remain substantial, with actually 7 sectors representing almost 85% of the total. As I mentioned, the recovery and reconstruction includes this premium for building back better. Housing is about 17% of the total needs. Transport is about 15%, commerce and industry 15%, but also then others, and also highlighting the needs linked to the management of explosive hazards. So as it was mentioned earlier, there's a high need for also making sure that land and recovery and reconstruction activities are safe. At this point, I'll pass to my colleague Tom, and Tom, you can then just tell me when to share the next slide.
Thanks, Susanna. Could you just click one more time? Great, thanks so much. So I'm just going to briefly talk through the kind of priority expenditures on building back during 2024. So the first point to make is that obviously the 486 billion is a pretty overwhelming number. It is not a number that the resources are there to support right now, nor even if they were, choices would need to be made about what to do and when. So prioritization is really important in that context. The government has gone through a very extensive process in 2024 to identify, first of all, to monitor what they have been doing, be able to show the progress that has been made, especially with the donor money that's come, but also to identify what are the priorities going forward. So coordinated through the Ministry of Restoration, there was a process over several months to look at more than 700 different projects across 20 sectors, identified by line ministries as priorities. Detailed project costs, funding needs were identified, and a lot of consultation went on with partners and sector experts to kind of try to come down to what should be done in 2024. Next slide. So this is just a quick top-line overview of what the RDNA presented as the priorities coming from line ministries for 2024. The top-line number in terms of the public expenditures that need to take place is around $15 billion US. That excludes about $3.5 billion of social protection expenditures, which are kind of consistently in the budget, so aren't included as part of the RDNA. The good news, I guess, is that there's a fair amount of that already in the budget, already funded either through the government's own revenues or support from donors in terms of grants and loans, $5.5 billion, but it still leaves $9.5 billion in unfunded or unmet funding needs for 2024, which is a combination of public investment, some other expenditures, but also a fair amount of financing that's intended to support private investment. And we talked about the importance of private investment. And there's a number of programs that are underway from the government and others to provide working capital support, subsidies, both for private industry, but also in the housing sector. So the hope is there can be quite a significant amount of these needs that are also met directly through the private sector. Up to 11 billion is estimated for 2024. Next slide. And just to close out, while there's a need to spend quickly to meet the huge amount of needs, it's also really important that the spending is effective and efficient. And there's a lot of discussion about the reform process and how that can support it. So just to maybe highlight a few things, and I think my colleague Carlos will probably talk a bit about this when he comes in, but accelerating the reforms from the government's Ukraine plan for economic growth and modernization linked to the EU framework is a high priority to make sure that the spending for reconstruction is as effective as possible. And 3 points on that. One, how to strengthen public sector capacity. And that includes not only building the capacity of institutions to plan and deliver, but also to prioritize. So that 15 billion that I talked about in the last slide, that comes kind of bottom up from lots of different line ministries who have needs. But there's also a need for the government at a central level to make a decision, from the top down as to saying these are the different, these how we choose across sectoral priorities. The government has adopted the PIM, the Public Investment Management Roadmap, which also includes setting up a Strategic Investment Council. So there's a lot of reform activity that should really support improved public capacity to plan and deliver on reconstruction. Secondly is to boost the capacity of local authorities and communities, because a lot of the investments will be taking place at the local level. A lot of them are happening right now. And so capacity building there will be important. And then finally, we talked several times about the importance of the private sector. Getting the private sector to come in and invest will depend very much on a number of reforms, both in the business environment and in the financial sector to stimulate their participation. So next slide. Just to summarize, I don't know, Susanna, if you want me to cover this, just as, these are the numbers that we presented, the damages of 152 billion, the needs over 10 years of 486 billion, and 15 billion in priorities for 2024. You can see the split across sectors there. Housing, industry are the top two, as well as energy being very high. So let us stop there. I think there's one more slide just pointing you to the report that's available.
Indeed, the report in English is available. I can also put it in the chat, or we can share it later. And then Ukrainian translation is also being prepared. So thank you very much, and we remain here for any questions.
Thank you very much. It's quite an impressive piece of work you are doing, I must say. And it's also impressive to hear how the government of Ukraine and all the partners you're working with actually work for building back better, to put it that way. Is there anybody who would like to put a question? We have a couple of minutes before it's 5 o'clock when we're having a break. It's a bit difficult when you get all these figures to put the right question, of course. I think the previous speaker talked about Beirut becoming a private sector investment boom area. And the question, of course, is whether is that a good, you need private investment, but how do you balance private investment with the public investment, I think, is important. I don't know whether you would like to comment on that, Susanna or Thomas. Either of you could probably comment on it. Susanna.
I think, Tom, you can go ahead. You are more on this.
No, I mean, I don't. Look, it's there's no right answer to that. I mean, I would say two things. So one, there's a lot of the investments that need to happen are public investments, right? I mean, public infrastructure that the private sector won't necessarily pick up or don't have the incentive to pick up. But there are a lot of the investments, and whether it's whether it's in the industry sector, whether it's in transport, whether clearly in housing, where the private sector is likely to take the lead. But as I said, there needs to be a coordination, both in terms of the public and infrastructure investment that makes private investments pay off, raises the level, raises the chance for higher productivity, and it enables returns to be higher. But there's also a lot of public policy that has to happen, and this is where we start talking about the reforms that is needed for the private sector to step in. So yeah, let me start. Just sorry, one more point to make is the IFC, which is part of the World Bank, last year did a report on the potential for the private sector to participate in rebuilding, which I think could be quite useful, and we can send a link to that as well. Thanks.
Could I also put another question to you, Thomas? From your point of view in the World Bank, what would you say would be the most important initiative in order to secure participation from civic society in the rebuilding of Ukraine?
That's a more difficult question for me. I don't know if Susanna has a view on that. I mean, I mean, I think Ukraine, has a, as far as I know, has a pretty long history of a strong civic society, right? And we see a lot of engagement of civil society right now in planning for reconstruction. So, I mean, I think obviously safety on the ground is an important part of that. And beyond that, it's about having the resources available as well. Again, as I mentioned, kind of at the local level as well. Having, a lot of the civil society will be participating very much at the community level, and so making sure that resources are available and public capacity is available at the local level to deliver on this, I think it will be important as well.
So
sure
the local authorities have to put a special emphasis on this as well. Yes. I think we got a question. Helge Onsrud will help us.
A highly political question here. Will it be possible to force Putin and Russia to pay the 500 billion?
A proper political question. How can we make Putin pay?
I should have said this one at the beginning.
Pay grades, yeah.
Yeah, I should have said our report is not for any claims purposes. It's really merely a damage and needs assessment. So the report doesn't go to that or provide information for that part. Yeah.
Quite a sensible position and a sensible answer, I guess. Okay, I think we will take a break now. We will start again at 5:15 Norwegian time. Okay, welcome back again. Let's hope we are many people attending now. It's a great pleasure for me now to introduce the next speaker. It's Lesia Orgrytsko, difficult names for Norwegians this. She has a background as a civil servant in the UN system and the Ukrainian Minister Reform Delivery Office. And she is Deputy Chief of Party at USAID, I gather. And most importantly, perhaps, she is also has an important role in RISE, which is a coalition on reconstruction containing NGOs, I have been told. And for me, it will be most interesting to hear how central institutions and foreign NGOs work, but also how this includes integrating initiatives from the local communities in Ukraine. So, Lesia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. And let me perhaps start with a slightly more personal note. And that is, over the past 2 years, I've attended, I don't know how many dozens of different conferences and discussions on Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. And while during the first 6 to 9 months, perhaps, these served as a true source of inspiration, of a source of hope, because many of the Ukrainians, especially living in Ukraine, were thinking that this war wouldn't take so long. Now we are entering the 3rd year of this war. And I must say, unfortunately, that conferences and discussions about recovery and reconstruction have ceased to be a source of inspiration and have rather turned into, a source of irritation sometimes. And don't get me wrong, as was already presented, I represent the biggest coalition of Ukrainian think tanks and NGOs that work in the reconstruction and recovery area. I represent a USAID project that capacitates hundreds and hundreds of Ukrainian civil society organizations that are dealing with recovery and will be further doing that in the future. But as a Ukrainian who constantly lives under shelling and under missile attacks, as a Ukrainian who witnessed the city of Kharkiv, a 1 million city, is being just erased from the surface. As a Ukrainian who witnessed that Chernihiv, one of the oldest cities of Ukraine, has yet again last week suffered an immense missile attack with 2 children or even 3 children dying. As somebody who personally, couple of weeks ago, a part of a missile exploded just 250 meters away from my apartment block in a place, in a park where I, on a daily basis, walk with my 7-month-old child. I do believe that all the discussions about reconstruction, about building back better, about restoration of Ukraine are null and void unless we have the priorities straight. And the priorities, under priorities straight, what I mean is that in order for us as the collective West or the global community, if we want to help rebuild Ukraine, we have first and foremost make sure that this country exists by the time that we will be rebuilding and the big Marshall Plan enters into the game. So I think we all have to understand that all of these discussions have to rest on the premise that we have to invest in Ukraine's defense if we want to decrease the funds that will be further used for Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. And I cannot but thank the Norwegian government and the generous Norwegian support of the Norwegian people to Ukraine. We do feel it. I can just express the plea from all of us, the citizens of Ukraine, to please continue doing that and supporting us until our victory. Now, going back, Alan, to your question, let me a little bit extend perhaps the question and address Ukraine's resilience and Ukraine's reconstruction, not just from the interplay of central government and international institutions, but rather look at Ukraine's resilience and reconstruction from the viewpoint of the interplay of different societal groups and of the role of the non-state actors in Ukraine's recovery. Now, what very often happens when Ukraine is being analyzed, or let me paraphrase, in the very few cases when Ukraine has been analyzed, because let's be honest, Ukraine wasn't very much existing on the mental maps of many European and other countries up until 2022. But what usually happened is that Ukraine was analyzed from, I would say, from an institutional perspective, which makes sense to many Western European countries where there is a very long tradition of different institutions, of democratic governance, etc. But an approach which I think is very often misleading when we talk about Ukraine. And that is for 2 reasons. The number one reason for me is that Ukraine has inherited, as a heritage basically from the Soviet era, has inherited a tremendously high level of distrust to all the vertical power structures, i.e. to the government, whether it's the national government or the subnational level, to all kinds of institutions, of officials, of law enforcement, you name it. And as a result of it, or rather as a compensation of this distrust, Ukrainians during the Soviet era learned to fall back on very horizontal links. So basically building connections people to people, where you have a very small circle of people you can actually trust. And that has predominantly been family, friends, perhaps friends of friends, perhaps your work colleagues, but this depends whether you would trust them or not. Now, what happened ever since 1991, when Ukraine regained its independence, we have had a number of revolutions. You might have heard of the Orange Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, or the Euromaidan and other uprisings. One of the effects of these societal changes were that this very small circle of people that you trust were seeing a very big spark of increasement, where you were standing, for example, on the Maidan, which is the central square of Kyiv, the capital, and you were sharing the square with absolutely unfamiliar to you people, to your left and to your right. You were sharing food. You were sharing a lot of money. You were doing constant donations to people you wouldn't know. You were sharing very sensitive information, very sensitive data that could be potentially of harm to absolutely unknown people, which basically led to the fact that every new revolution in Ukraine, this circle of the trust and of horizontal networks was increasing with very high speed and quantity. The second reason why Ukraine shouldn't be looked at from the institutional perspective is the fact that, again, as a heritage of the Soviet era, Ukraine inherited very weak or considerably weak government institutions. One of the reasons of that is that basically all of the decision making and all of the policy decisions have been made in Moscow. And then what usually happened is that these decisions were basically transferred down to the so-called public administrations or institutions of the other Soviet republics for them basically to copy-paste, for them to replicate, to transpose this legislation into the national legislation. Hence, there hasn't been a very long tradition of, good governance and any type of democratic processes, because that wasn't just the case for when you live under the Soviet rule. Now, you might think why I'm boring you with all of these details of Soviet era legacy. As a result of those 2 points that I mentioned, on the one hand, the trust issue, the distrust to vertical powers, and the very high trust to horizontal one, and the weak government institutions on the other, is that in Ukraine, you basically have a very, very strong role of non-state actors. That's number one. And number two, the traditional government functions are very often dispersed and decentralized and get distributed among these very same non-state actors. When I'm talking about non-state actors, I mean the broader sense of civil society. I'm talking about NGOs, charity organizations, media, political circles, the church, importantly, private initiatives, businessmen, etc., etc. And basically, as a result of this, that Ukraine's basically has a very unique societal landscape and the landscape of non-state actors that very often play state functions, you have a wide range of these different functions that are being played by these actors. For example, take the legislative sphere. You have a huge number of different think tanks and civic initiatives that are basically being outsourced by Ukraine's parliament or by Ukraine's government institutions for them to not just conduct stakeholder consultations, but basically provide ready-made solutions to policy problems. We have, for example, when we are talking about reconstruction, we have the Rise Coalition that has been tremendously helping Ukraine's parliament and Ukraine's Ministry of Restoration in delivering quite a number of legislative acts that will be governing Ukraine's reconstruction for the coming many years. We have the DREAM system, you might have heard, which is an innovative digital pipeline of all reconstruction projects that will be used by Ukrainian government and by international institutions, which is basically a coordination platform, a public investment management system, a very, very comprehensive one. Again, has been initiated by civil society, piloted by civil society, and then given to the government. And this is now a government-led system. You have instances where, again, these different non-state actors have penetrated different either communities, the regional state administrations, or the government-led institutions in producing different reforms. For example, when we're talking about reconstruction, we have, again, different non-state actors, different civil society organizations that help communities come up with their own regional plan. Now, that is really important because unless a community has a regional development plan, it is not entitled to any national or even international financial resources to conduct rebuilding and restoration projects. Now we have, again, NGOs that not just help, but sometimes really are outsourced by these different communities to help draft the big, blueprint for a certain community. You have, again, civil society organizations that are providing public services, or, for example, who are the best deliverers of humanitarian aid. If we look back 10 years ago, when this war actually started with the Donbass aggression, you had the churches being the best providers of humanitarian aid to hard-to-reach areas, especially when it comes to non-government controlled areas. It was thanks to the Protestant networks that are especially vocal and especially strong in the east of Ukraine, in Donbass, that really helped reach people who the government of Ukraine couldn't help. The number one function of the state, providing security. Again, even here in Ukraine, we have huge charity organizations that are raising so much money that it's basically a second provider of the necessary ammunition supply to the armed forces of Ukraine. And I can go on listing different types of services and different types of functions that usually in a democratic country the formal institutions and the government would play, whereas in Ukraine it does have a bit of a different landscape. I'm not telling you that in order to discourage, cooperation with the government. Just on the contrary, I do believe the government has a very important role to play and needs a lot of support. The ministries, especially central institutions, are extremely undercapacitated, with a lot of people either serving or having had to flee, or just due to unbearable conditions and very low wages are just really not making it. But I'm rather telling you that if you are looking at a successful outcome of your intended projects in Ukraine, you really have to understand that this is not just an agreement between your organization, but whether it's a big international one or a smaller INGO and the government. It has to look at the different success stories of Ukraine that were that showcase basically that successful reforms, successful transformations, and successful, I hope, recovery projects usually rest on the interplay between central government, civil society organization, the business representatives, and international interlocutors. So it's basically either a triangle or a rectangle. Now, I would like to conclude perhaps with just a couple of recommendations. My coalition was holding 10 focus group discussions with leading Ukrainian NGOs that are now dealing with reconstruction in every single area, whether it's healthcare, education, social protection, etc. And there are a couple of, observations and recommendations that I kept hearing in every single round of these consultations. One of the most repetitive ones was perhaps the one of international organizations not studying the context, not understanding the social fabric, basically what I was trying to deliver to you during the first couple of minutes, and the different stakeholders that have a particular role to play in Ukraine's resilience and recovery. Second is everything related to building the capacities of local organizations and this overall global trend of going local. And I think it is really key that you look at Ukrainian civil society organizations really as your strategic implementing partners, or just your partners in approaching bigger financial resources and not just the beneficiaries. Because we can continue talking about how great localization is, but unless we do it, it will remain just plain words. The fourth one is the importance to invest in local networks and in the ability to form alliances. As I've said, Ukraine has made tremendous progress in terms of building the trust on the horizontal level, but there is still a lot of room for improvement. And I think we will get stronger if these ties between the different networks, and especially the cross-sectoral ones between communities, between civil society organizations, between private sector representatives and other stakeholders. And this is basically what the story of Ukraine's successful reforms ever since 2013 shows, that unless there is this rectangle or triangle of cooperation, you will not really succeed in Ukraine if you're thinking about systematic changes. And the very last point, and I will stop here, also very often mentioned by these different stakeholders that we've engaged, was the flexibility of programming and flexibility of action. The war changed us a lot, but Ukrainians wouldn't have survived, especially during the first 2 to 3 months, where, let's be honest, nobody in the world really believed that we could make it, was because we were agile, we were flexible, and we were creative. And this is sometimes, or not sometimes, quite often, when something that we lack when we are cooperating with international organizations, especially the bigger ones. Of course, we understand the bureaucracy, the different project cycles. I myself have been working in the UN. I've been working in the Ukrainian government. I understand when I talk about bureaucracy. But in times of war, when Ukraine is literally bleeding, I think there is some room for international organizations to loosen up a little bit these procedures to really make an impact locally. I will stop here and looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lesia. May I just ask you, I remember at WUF 11, World Urban Forum in Katowice, at some events about Ukraine, somebody said Ukraine is now overflooded of aid organizations wanting to do things in Ukraine. It's like a tsunami, they said. How do you actually manage to sort of handle the large amount of parties involved in a transparent and accountable manner, whilst being flexible, as you mentioned, and sort of agile in your programming? How do you actually manage that in reality?
I think part of the answer is one of the stronger Ukraine's features developed over the last couple of years, and that is digitalization. Ukraine is one of the leading countries in terms of digitalized public services and other services to Ukrainian citizens and beyond. And why I'm talking about digitalization is because this dream ecosystem that I was referring to, this big platform that basically has a huge pipeline of all of the different projects that every single community would like to rebuild, is placed on that platform. And it would work as follows. You as let's say you are Borodyanka city council, and you have 5 schools and 2 hospitals and certain number of roads and bridges that have to be rebuilt. You are uploading the portfolio of these different projects into the Dream platform. And the platform is at the same time available to government entities and to international stakeholders. You have certain criteria and certain filters that you can apply. For example, you are a Norwegian player, and you are interested in only Kyivska Oblast, for example, and you apply a filter, and you have in the system all of the Kyiv Oblast infrastructure objects that require assistance, and then you click on this particular school, all of the other donors and other actors who would like to help Ukraine already see that this particular project is already taken by Norway. Or you are interested only in healthcare facilities, and then you apply a filter and you will see all of the healthcare facilities across Ukraine that have been severely damaged or destroyed, and you again can make the link directly with the community. And this is a system basically that provides a tool for direct communication between international actors and all of the other actors that will be playing a role in Ukraine's reconstruction, and the communities, because as we all understand, communities are the backbone of Ukraine's reconstruction. And by doing this, we are trying to avoid this chaos, because indeed Ukraine is enjoying a lot of support. But as I already mentioned, this is great, but first and foremost is the support that we need currently in our defense capabilities.
Thank you very much, Licia. You will be part of, I think we'll wait till the debate afterwards with other questions. You will be part of the conversation we'll have then, so we can hear more from you then. Thank you. We will then move on to the next contributor. That's Carlis Smits. He's based in Kiev. He's lead economist and program leader of the economic policy Eastern Europe of the World Bank. And he's also facilitating the policy dialogue between the Ukrainian government and foreign aid and political organizations. And of course, it's very interesting for us to hear about how, for instance, do one apply EU elements on transparency, rule of law for post-war situations or housing and infrastructure in a manner that strengthens Ukraine's governmental reforms. So the floor is yours, Carlis.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for this invitation. Before I start, I was inspired and always inspired. The objective of the World Bank, as many other organizations, is to help people of Ukraine now. And as previous speaker mentioned, the only way to limit the harm is to stop this Russia invasion as soon as possible. Having said that, I'll focus on three things: is how we do, particularly foreign aid, particularly help people of Ukraine in this dire situation. Why do we do in a particular way, and what can be done better? Let me start with the first challenges, and the World Bank has been during the first days and hours to help people of Ukraine. This is a very unique situation, and this is not only attack on people of Ukraine, it is attack on a governance structure of Ukraine. And one of the key institutions to being attacked was ability of the government to provide public services. So the first and foremost, the primary objective of foreign aid was to maintain continuation of the public services. And while there are kind of many organizations that could help, we made a decision even before the war has started. The only way how to efficiently provide that source was to enable government to deliver its public service obligations. And that decision was made that any aid that we provided would be provided through the budget of Ukraine, because we wanted to enable and strengthen the governance systems, and we believe the governance systems of Ukraine are strong for that purpose. And maybe for some of you that might sound as a contradiction, because you have kind of seen a lot of evidence, and obviously statistics show that in terms of the corruption accountability, Ukraine is lagging behind. And indeed, there are a lot of challenges Ukraine faced prior to the war. But in one area, and Leslie already kind of also mentioned digitalization. Ukraine has kind of made a lot of strides to strengthen delivery of the public service delivery, including digitalization. All payroll is happening through the banking system. There is kind of a digital app that provides social benefits, and it allows attractability and accountability. And also the public finance systems, a lot of things were kind of strengthened prior to the war. there is accountability, and we know if the wages are being paid to the teachers. We immediately know through the single treasury account and through the banking system that money went to those who are needed. My point being is that such systems and provision of the budget support to the existing budget system helps in twofold. It kind of enables credibility of the government, and during the war that is especially very important, because in a sense that is a source of kind of confidence. The second, it is the most efficient way to provide social services and benefits. For example, pension payments is a single most important system how to provide benefit to those people that can be done in a timely way. We have worked with the Ministry of Finance and the government, for example, that pensions to those who are internally displaced or have to flee their homes could be immediately repaid. They just needed to go and provide either the new bank account or the new registration system. So that is one kind of mention the most important. And the reason why also we mention we use the budget systems, and we continue to use budget systems of the government to Ukraine, is because of the volumes of help that Ukraine needs through, particularly today during the relief stage, are enormous. This year alone, Ukraine's external budget financing needs are about $38 billion per year, 2024. Why is that? First, obviously, because of the revenues have kind of declined quite significantly because economic activity is disrupted. And secondly, the tax revenue that Ukrainians are kind of collecting go to the defense. And obviously, defense is a national security necessity that they need to provide. So therefore, to provide these essential government services, education, health, social transfers, that relies on these donor transfers. That is, I think it's an important mention of why we do this way. And we feel confident we have accountability systems that you're using the budget systems, and we also do the monthly surveys asking people whether the government services are being received, pensions paid, and we see that this is happening despite the war happening on time. A lot of speakers today spoke about three phases: short-term, medium, and kind of a long-term. And there, one of the lessons we kind of learn is that in Ukraine, we need to think about these three phases, not kind of something about it tomorrow, but I think even today, during this relief stage, we need to also think about economic recovery, and we also start to think about economic kind of reconstruction. Let me spend a few words about recovery and reconstruction and how that governance structures play in and why that is also an important. In a stage of economic recovery, we don't need to wait for end of the war. People of Ukraine need jobs even today, and economic activity is important to sustain livelihoods. And obviously, economic recovery today would require some form of the government support. Government support in terms of them providing liquidity assistance, small, medium enterprises, providing access to the credit, etc., etc. It also requires addressing some of the logistical constraints. For example, Black Sea corridor, reopening the Black Sea corridor, we need a lot of that public intervention in a short run, establishing a security corridor, establishing an insurance mechanism, and that provides a lot of resources. One of the key challenges in this particular recovery is deciding which sectors of economic activity to support more. And obviously in this recovery stage, like in any war, it creates a lot of opportunity for economic rents. And I think government of Ukraine, I want to reiterate, is looking very actively in taxing these sectors that have large economic rents in the short term. And I think this is very important to limit ability for certain sectors to make excessive rents. I'll give you one example from last year, which originated. In a way, wartime, as I mentioned, the public services and public wages continue to be paid, and obviously during the wartime, national saving rates increase. So as a byproduct of that activity, the banking system, Ukraine's banking system, has excess interest income during the last year, which resulted in the fact that despite the war, the banking system has excess profits. The government took an unusual step, a very brave step, a very difficult step, to add additional tax on interest income last year in 70%, which was the first time in Ukraine's history a specific tax to take back some of these excess rents is being applied. So I'll give you an example of how it is very important that the governance systems are being also strengthened by reducing these rent-seeking abilities that are very difficult to reverse when these rent-seeking abilities have deeply entrenched. In terms of the economic kind of recovery, other kind of a second example where Ukraine has kind of taken steps. This is the last heating season, was the first heating season over the last decade, where Ukrainians were not kind of government was not panicking whether they would have a sufficient gas storage supplies for the heating season. And in part, again, this was in part of the reforms that the government made to make the market more transparent, that there are no kind of arbitrage opportunities in someone kind of storing necessary gas for the heating season, then asking government to excessive price for that. The third stage is, and what a lot of people alluded, is to physical construction. And I would agree with Lesia, kind of maybe in some areas, full-blown reconstruction is a little bit premature because there are no means to do that. There are no fiscal means, including for donor side, because of that budget support that would be needed this year and next year is still not fully covered. But having said that, there is an important aspect in reconstruction we need to think is, it is so-called soft reconstruction. We need to reconstruct and start to think about the reform process of future Ukraine. And future Ukraine is very clear. Ukraine will be a member of European Union. And in order to become a member of European, obviously there's a body of law that needs to be adopted, and the homework is quite extensive. But there's one important aspect for Ukraine to become a member. It also needs to grow. Its GDP per capita as a share of EU needs to significantly increase, because at the current level, Ukraine's GDP per capita as a share of EU's is about 12% in the current dollar terms. And obviously at that level, it would be very difficult to be a part of the member state, where most of the kind of one of the core elements is kind of redistribution of budget resources. So Ukraine needs to think already today about that reconstruction, particularly strengthening its country systems. And there we have worked with the government of Ukraine to put kind of a reform matrix and what would be these reforms that are needed for that future of Ukraine. And one of the kind of areas which stand out is obviously governance. It is strengthening the rule of law and protection of the property rights. So having said that, this would be kind of very important for Ukraine's next transition, and a transition which already starts today, is strengthening the country systems, strengthening the rule of law. As I mentioned, most of the money currently goes through the country systems, but the budget systems. But in future, the reconstruction will be, and the growth will be led by the private sector. And for the private sector to be leading that growth, rule of law, accountability, and transparency are kind of areas which are enormously needed. Most countries, and a lot of countries, struggle with that agenda, because it's a very difficult to kind of there is a healthy debate in many countries, but the advantage to Ukraine is, in a lot of senses, there's no debate about the direction where they are going. Direction is quite clear. Is accession in European Union, and EU has a very kind of a clear kind of a governance structure, what is meant by rule of law, what is meant by a transparent judiciary, and that process is obviously started. To summarize, there are these three stages where kind of governance is playing a very important role. So in the relief stage, we focus mainly on a kind of budget systems, where leakage is actually quite difficult to make, is because in a sense most of the wage bill and budget information is transparent. Then the second is supporting economic activity, where there is kind of the predominantly we focus on making sure that rent seeking is not happening in a specific sectors that have a preferential access to the market, etc. And then in a longer run reconstruction phase, it is strengthening the reform agenda and the rule of law and judiciary for the long term. What can be done better? And I'll use the same framework on the three. What could be done in a relief stage better? Ukraine is a large country and especially very diverse. While we have seen that systems at the central level are very robust, systems at the subnational level are less robust. There are municipalities that benefit enormously, including the windfall tax revenues, for example, from the personal income tax from those who are soldiers, particularly Kiev municipality, which benefited quite significantly last year. There are municipalities that are close to the front line that are facing enormous challenges. There are municipalities where the people have left. There are municipalities where people have population have increased quite significantly. So currently, or the focus of the World Bank is we want to kind of strengthen this intergovernmental systems to making sure that that money trickles down also to the subnational level, strengthening their systems exactly the same way as strengthening systems at the national level. In terms of the economic recovery, what can be done better? What can be done more better is to make these systems more efficient. Budget resources are very limited, so any support for particular enterprises or particular businesses or people need to be made more efficient. That also making a recognition that spatial distribution will change after the war. Some of the industries will not have a competitive advantage. Especially Ukraine will be trading more with the European Union, so Ukraine's regions in the West would have the better comparative advantage. The third one is what can be done in reconstruction? And there, one of the kind of challenges is that while it's very easy to absorb money for the wage bill and current public services, absorbing money, foreign aid for capital investment tends to be very cumbersome. Last year, while Ukraine absorbed tens of the billions of dollars for the budget support for current expenditures, in terms of the capital expenditures, they were just absorbing just $7 billion. So for that, the three things need to be done. First is the PIM systems need to be strengthened, particularly also then public investment management. The way how investments decisions are being done, that needs to be centralized. There has to be a single project pipeline. The needs have to be independent of what is the source of the financing, because often there is a case that specific donors say that we will finance for that particular item, and then sometimes things are being financed that Ukraine does not need. The second is we need to kind of recognize that there is only one institution and one entity, United States of America, which provided grants, sizable grants for Ukraine. Most other donors provide loans to Ukraine. So while these are in concessional terms, these loans are also kind of Ukraine needs to pay interest of about 5%. So whatever money you take from donors to do reconstruction, you have to make sure that these are having economic or social return. So it's very important to do that due diligence also on Ukrainian side, that these would have returns for the people of Ukraine over the medium to long run. And there again, public investment systems and role of the Ministry of Finance as a gatekeeper is very important. And finally, what needs to be done is strengthening capacity, implementation, and through the whole project cycle, what Ukraine would need it, and their capacity strengthening is very important, in particular also to minimize some of these risks, what are associated with corruption and other problems. One of the largest one of the biggest traditionally risks with corruption in these kind of instances is procurement. And when it comes to the capital investment, procurement is one of these items where we need to kind of go strengthen the domestic systems. What we, World Bank, have kind of tried to strengthen, again, using the same metaphor, strengthening Ukraine's own procurement system, Prozoro, to make it transparent, to ask also that all other IFIs try to use Ukraine's domestic procurement systems to increase transparency and increasing accountability, and that going forward is important to limit a lot of these risks which I mentioned. And that's all I want to kind of say with the process of the governance. It is a work that we need to help Ukrainians strengthen every day. It takes a lot of effort, but the goalpost is very clear, and Ukraine's vision going towards the European Union is helping through that process. And this process will not be easy, but it's going to be important in every stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carles. I did notice that you mentioned property rights at one stage. To be very concrete and precise, what would you say is the most important things to do about property rights?
I mean, once it's strengthening property rights, it's strengthening the judiciary system, that there is no question about the property rights, that it includes strengthening bankruptcy rules, etc., so that anyone who comes and invests in Ukraine feels safe about that property. Having said that, obviously, currently, the biggest risk to any property right is security concerns, and obviously that goes without saying that security also needs to be strengthened. But without the security, you also need to strengthen judiciary system.
Thank you. Excellent. We could have gone on talking about this, I think. It's interesting, and the connection between one presenter to the other is also very interesting. Now we are going to meet Alexander Anisimov. He is attached to the Kharkiv School of Architecture and also as a doctoral researcher to the Alvar Aalto Architectural School in Finland. He is the head of an NGO called New Housing Policy in Ukraine, and he's a co-author of the report Rebuilding a Place Called Home. Remember what we heard about in the keynote speech, I think it was. You have stated clearly, Alexander, 10 principles of strategic importance to secure a good reconstruction of Ukraine. So we are looking forward to hear what you think is most important.
Thank you all. Do you hear me well? I hope so.
Yes.
So thank you again for having me here. I will try to be brief. My talk is focused now on regional construction and development in the economy, but also the spatial dimension of the recovery. So as was already said, I'm currently a doctoral researcher, and I'm also head of the Center for Land and Housing Research at Kharkiv School of Architecture. And our key topics relate to this intersection of land and housing rights. So basically, you've all seen and heard about the damage in Ukraine to the housing sector, to different other infrastructures, businesses. A lot of objects have been destroyed. However, we do not have a great account of how to deliver a better world or better construction, because over the last 20 years, we've been building possibly one of the worst quality built environments in Europe. And I think we do not want this to happen after the war ends, and even in the midst when we try to recover what's been lost. The question is, where do we start with this? There is a lot of things to do about it, unfortunately, and there is no single answer. So I just wanted to kind of show our approach towards land and housing issue, and then relate to the regional dimension, and then go back to the local level. So basically, in Ukraine, this kind of duality of housing as financial assets has been really an important point in the recovery in the 2000s and 2010s, and much less as a consumption good that we expect housing to be: a place of home, a place of personal security, where you feel yourself good. It has become, especially in the central areas of big cities, a stock of collateral or stock of wealth, just to build up your own personal wealth. And this problem presents itself here because we do not want housing in Ukraine and the recovery process to become another financial asset for people. Our take about housing is that it is social infrastructure. It has all of the components that related to any other kind of infrastructure. It's a network in the system. It addresses social, environmental, economic goals. It delivers these community service obligations. It is obviously a monopoly if you own land over housing, under housing. It is indeed delivered by a variety of providers. And the most important thing that I want to focus your attention here, that this performance needs to be reinforced by appropriate regulation. What do we mean by regulation in this condition? Clearly, if housing is infrastructure, it needs policy, it needs public governance. Free market, in Ukrainian case, no less than in other places, has been unable to provide housing for low and middle income groups. And we have all of the available data that we could expect. We also had almost zero social housing units before the war. And in our discussion, if we're going to talk about livable cities and livable communities, housing policy is an essential component of how you deliver those cities and those communities, because otherwise nothing can be sustainable if you don't access decent housing. This is no easy task, right? Where do we start? First, I thought of this image that I've seen the first year of the war, that people started to recreate with one of the projects to look at the potential housing redevelopment. And I saw this kind of building any housing for anyone. So this visionary or some kind of wishful understanding of how housing systems and land systems work. And in essence, was this missing links between conditions of destroyed housing units, their land and ownership rights, economic capacities of people, being disrelated to the actual processes where people are still sheltered in this substandard apartments built in this haphazard way somewhere across Ukraine, and also wanting for people to become kind of living a good life. And this problem of misunderstanding, of missing links, is a huge one here. Because housing indeed needs policy and public governance. Otherwise, it's going to be built not where it's needed. It's going to be built not for those that need it. And it's not going to be built to quality standards and sustainability standards. And this is what we've had for the last 20 years in Kyiv, especially in Lviv, a lot of places across the country. Housing has been built, but it does not deliver growth in quality of life. It doesn't deliver new services. It doesn't really deliver anything good to the community. And to kind of look back and how can we reshape this approach, we need to look at how can we start from regions, go back to municipalities, and then see where municipalities stand at this intersection. Why Kyiv is so kind of interesting. This is one of the papers from 2007, but recent reports indicate that the situation is quite the same. This black hole in the middle of Ukraine was the share of the economy proportional to its geography, and the central spot is Kyiv. So the central capital, according to the data they gathered in 2007, was approximately 13% of annual growth and approximately 18% of the whole economy of Ukraine. This data has only increased. These numbers have only increased. Now it's around 15% growth and 20% of the whole economy by the data that was present before the war. Real geography of war, however, positions us at this kind of intersection of a variety of challenges and local communities that are now the key actor in responding to local needs and services, and also providing basic housing options, are being under various stress. And clearly there is discussion about these three levels or three types of Ukrainian communities, or three types of regions to which those communities belong, such as the safe ones, which are green here, the yellow ones, which are so-called more or less safe areas, and then there is this kind of orange to red areas, which are considered unsafe or which are considered problematic. And you see, for instance, that Kharkiv is obviously, Chernihiv, Sumy, Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv, Kherson are these large cities that are now under heavy stress from war. But what I thought is that indeed those cities have suffered a lot, but what we don't see is the smaller places, the municipalities that are between those larger places. And recently came across the report is about financial health and capability of municipalities per region. And funnily enough, it's not the war regions that, it's not just the regions where there is a war impact, but there is a lot of regions from the Western Ukraine, such as Zakarpattia, Chernivtsi, Chernobyl, where there is a lot of unhealthy budgets on the local level, which seem to me paradoxical because those regions have not suffered. They had an influx of IDPs. They were able to leverage international funding and a lot of other things. So this points us that even though the questions of war damage and the war impact are huge, there is a lot of issues on the local level and the ability of the local level to effectively respond to providing basic services. Where does that leave us? For the moment being, this regional level shows us that smaller municipalities are indeed currently often incapable and unable to handle these extra duties which we're talking about, such as new investment, shaping policies, designing strategies, and so on. And those regional imbalances, as in the paper by Vladimir, are just putting more strain on the infrastructure and set up growing disparities of quality of life for the generations to come. And we're talking about the disparities that are going to grow by percentage and also by the quality of those generations. This problem cannot be solved by any simple regional funding system or state funding. This is indeed a question of multi-level governance and multi-sector cooperation, because only purposeful and mission-led financial institutions can create leverage for those smaller communities, for the municipalities that are not accessing international funding, donor funding, to set up a local growth and necessary infrastructure for the quality of life that people expect to have after the war. It is also a question about being able to finance places where housing is needed. Because what's currently happening in the absence of those purposeful funding and investment systems is that purposeful, unpurposeful, and unmission-led so-called investment systems are taking place, led by the idea of a private market regulating itself. So the dream pipeline, in a way, is a synthetic instrument which more or less revolves around the idea of a project marketplace. And this, in the current stage, even though its ambitions are quite high, it's now not anywhere close to recovery system. It is indeed a project marketplace where municipalities put up dozens or hundreds of projects of very low quality, which are just there flying in the system, which have no clear relation to the strategies, at best, a formal description of those projects and a very unclear expected outcome and a very unclear expected leverage for the local economy and for the sustainability of the communities. However, even though we see that the dream is evolving and there is a prospect of it becoming as some kind of a serious instrument for recovery, real money is coming other way. The money for housing certificates under Gjenoppbygging system is expected to deliver recovery and also some kind of growth by the virtue of people choosing where to live, essentially leading to recovery being concentrated in the specific regions, not where the recovery is potentially needed, but where people can access those funding. And especially critical problem is obviously Kyiv region, which was damaged, but not to the level as Kharkiv or Mykolaiv or Kherson, but is getting almost 50% of all of the funding from these systems. And this is leading us to question the approach where Kyiv region will attract even more investment from the current public spending systems and financing streams without really enforcing new jobs and abilities for people to get back to the places where they need to live or they want to live. However, they would flock to the central city expecting some job opportunities potentially, but also getting housing as an asset for the future, at this current moment, potentially a safe home, but obviously expecting for its prices to rise. This issue is not answering the real need, which is what our colleagues assessed last year, which is around 500,000 homes. So if you've seen the previous picture, it tells us there is a 45,000 on the repairs and 1,500 on the new homes bought. So it's a fraction. Even if all of the requests, as are shown right now, would be filled, it would be less than 1/4 of what's needed. There is no simple answer of how do we get there, how do we get to 500,000 homes, but this is the need that has a real evidence base behind it, based on the systems of IOM, which were referenced, and they provide a basic understanding that we need to assess our real housing needs and find an opportunity to deliver housing where it's needed and for the prices it's needed. However, if we just want to fund housing, it's not so easy. I will skip a few slides because I'm a little bit late on time. And just looking at the backstage of Ukrainian housing recovery. So a lot of places do not look destroyed per se or are not hit by the war. But what we have underlying is that we have a system of housing assets that is almost completely ungovernable. So we have less than 22% of all multi-apartment units in Ukraine have a home ownership association or a managing company, meaning that around 75% of all homes are basically unmanaged, but they're still owned by their respective owners. So this fractured ownership pattern with the poor maintenance leads to this lack of private funds, which leads us clearly for the extensive fossil fuel dependence and subsequent energy subsidies for the state. And there is a consistent need, which doesn't go away, for innovation of built structures. So here we see that there are two components of this housing problem. One from the homes being lost to the war and people resettled, and the other one is the depreciation and degradation of housing stock. How does that come by? The question is that the system of housing maintenance and management is a leaky one in Ukraine. You would expect people to maintain their assets in the best way they could. However, we inherited the system that was designed to be dysfunctional, and we didn't reform it. The system is indeed leaky, and it's leaky because there is no competent management body and there is no payment to capital repairs fund. So basically, homes are still managed by old Soviet non-reformed organizations who do not have capital maintenance capacities and also skills. Those homes are being under-maintained, and people who live there do not pay for capital repairs. And this system basically leads us to the question of how do we get to funding? And one of the things is about the land rights. Land rights is not the only problem within the system, but most of the multi-apartment buildings cannot even get a loan because homeowners have no right at the current moment for the land that lies beneath the building and are unable to get a loan to cover the cost for renovation or maintenance for the buildings. And this is very real. If you open a national cadastre, you cannot get a land plot for the multi-apartment building unless you form a homeownership association. But as I just said, there is just 22% of homeownership association across all multi-apartment buildings in Ukraine, meaning that more or less we have a system where just buildings are floating in the air, and if that building gets hit, which is the case in Kharkiv, for instance, people cannot reclaim their money back, even through the systems that are offered by the government, because they have no ownership of the land, and it's unclear who should fund the basic structure of the building, because people own apartments, but they co-own the stairs and all of the other infrastructures. But who is the competent management body? Who should be the contractor? Who should be the client for that recovery? That is a complex issue that needs to be resolved, and that requires obviously a huge input of public attention and public management, and also legal reforms on that level. But that also kind of keeps us with the problem of that we still fund homeowners who can own a very attractive apartments or a very attractive assets, and we subsidize them because those owners cannot get a renovation, as I just mentioned, and the state basically puts the money in drain pipe each year, which are just rising because we know very well that there is no way that energy costs are going to lower in any foreseeable future. The one thing that people hoped about was the Ukraine plan to address some of these issues. There is a short note on comprehensive regulation to ensure access to housing. However, being honest, even though this is the ambition, there is no real instruments to deliver that. Ukraine plan is not realistically assessing the housing system and this underlying unreformed system of ownership, because there is literally 80% of multi-apartment buildings, maybe less, are going to crumble in foreseeable future in 10, 20, 30 years without any war damage. And there is also a question of Ukraine not having ambition to develop social housing. I'm a part of the working group on a lot of laws, on the city construction law, on the social housing law. Ukraine has not put this as a real ambition on the national level. And this keeps us within the system of private home ownership, of private homeowners who want to get their housing through this state governmental subsidies. However, even when they get it, their housing in a lot of ways will still remain under-maintained in the perspective of 20 to 30 years, because they would not be able to afford to create a home ownership association. And instead of a conclusion, I was looking for ways how do we approach this point from the side of my kind of planning land use perspective. Clearly, spatial development and new investment is only possible under broader public law. And as I just said in the beginning of the presentation, housing is a part of public infrastructure, which needs to be set and regulated by the public bodies for people to be able to access it, because it delivers those necessary community services that are needed to recover the communities in Ukraine. And public law in Ukraine, the public spatial development programs such as general plan, master plans, they all regulate the current system. However, they're lacking focus on housing. There were a lot of cases of high quality renewal around the world, especially across Europe, that deliver needed diversity of housing options, that deliver needed densities, quality of life, public services, new amenities, and so on. But those things don't happen by themselves. There is a need for both planning instruments and capacities that are not currently in place. And the approach that is not still on the agenda in Ukraine is a system of district renewal. So taking the second part of the housing conundrum into discussion, I would offer everybody to look and focus on the district renewal system, as it touches upon almost 60% of whole housing stock in Ukraine. There is a lot of tools that are present and that are possible, but which are not underlooked, because the question of district renewal itself is not really currently on the political table of discussion. And those housing requirements that I've been just mentioning about accessibility and diverse typologies, different ownership tenures, different affordability discussions and points that are needed to be put in are not going to be delivered by private development. It hasn't been able to deliver those things in the past 20 years, and I have little hope that it could change and it could strategically mobilize itself to deliver necessary public services and necessary social housing. There is a lot of public planning policy instruments that can be used, and we should motivate local communities to use all of those instruments to set up land banking, inclusionary systems, renewal programs, which are all possible under Ukrainian law already. So in conclusion, there are 5 points I have. I think that the role of spatial planning and also regional development is underrated in the multitude of ways, because it can really solve, with the use of public instruments, the housing accessibility and affordability issue. We are really we're not understanding the possibility and the necessity of resolving questions of land ownership and then the use of land instruments to realize this effort. Municipalities clearly need a broader state-led or state-governed or publicly governed investment vehicles and institutions, such as development banks. We know KfW from Germany, to establish a playing field for regional recovery, which will focus on the municipalities that are not able to grow and are not able to recover themselves, especially. Also to deliver housing in those places and to set up possibilities for specialists to move to those communities. One of the opportunities that has been discussed elsewhere, but also in our research, is about National Housing Rental Development Program and National Housing Agency that can jumpstart a large part of their recovery using strategic loans for municipalities to set up new housing developments. Clearly, this all sums up that we are lacking currently public capacity to put all of the things on board. However, this process is not impossible. Almost every European country has gone through it after the Second World War, and the institutions that have been set up in Denmark, in Austria, in France, in Germany are still keeping the welfare state up to the standards that we expect it to be, and are able to maintain a lot of public housing, a lot of rental housing, and also a lot of social public facilities and institutional quality of those things to this day. So I expect us to be more ambitious in this regard and to look for this system to be set up not only in housing, but also in other municipal and social services. I think this is it for now, and really thank you for listening, and I hope this had a purposeful point for you as well.
Thank you so much, Alexander. You have quite a huge task ahead of you, don't you? It's quite awesome what type of challenges you have to solve. I think since Alexander is not being part of the panel, should we have one question for him? Have you got one, Helge, or there's none there yet?
I'm very glad that you highlight the issue of land ownership. Do I understand it correctly that most urban land, the land between and under the buildings, are still in municipal ownership, and you need some radical reform in this aspect to be able to underpin efficient reconstruction?
Indeed, it is in public ownership, but crucially, it's not used as public ownership. It is in public ownership, but it just stays there because nobody has taken it. And thinking about the quality recovery programs and renewal programs that are being tested and used elsewhere in Europe, it is indeed the municipal ownership of land that allows those investment to come in, because municipality can use their land rights to move on renewal programs, to set up municipal banking, land banking funds, and so on. So that is indeed an instrument also to attract investment, because land does not depreciate in most cases, and you could use it as a collateral in a lot of ways, or you could rent it out for development companies that are able to go in for the renewal program set up in municipality and actually create jobs and create the necessary refurbishments and densification or de-densification, depending on the case.
Exactly. Like they do in Finland, for instance, I guess. Thank you very much for this thought-provoking presentation. We are now moving on to the last speaker, and that will be Anatoly Kyryliuk from NORAD. NORAD is the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, and hello, nice to see you, and is responsible for the civic part of the Nansen program, which Norway is supporting Ukraine with. And last Friday, the agency announced a funding scheme to organizations contributing to inclusive and transparent recovery and democratic reforms, especially focusing on civil society. I don't know whether what you will tell us will help this quite deplorable housing situation that we just heard about, but I'm sure you will tell us about something that should be useful for Ukraine. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, and thank you for organizing this conference. It is really important to keep Ukraine on the agenda, and especially with this important topic. My name is Anatoly Kyryliuk, and I work in NORAD, but my academic background is within international relations and politics, and I also used to work in parliament in Ukraine as an advisor on anti-corruption issues, and the last 6.5 years I worked in the Norwegian-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce with trade issues between our two countries. But last December I joined NORAD, the Nansen team, to help to support Ukraine in these times. And my task today is to shed some light on the principles, how the program is built. I'm sure that audience in this room is very much familiar with this program, but for our guests in Ukraine, I can also mention some stones, pillars of this program that we in NORAD are very proud of. First of all, it is historically for Norway that the program is really supported by all the politicians from the opposition and the current government. And it is a really long-term program, because in this situation we have to think long-term as well as we take care of the hectic situations on the ground today. It is a very big program. I'm very happy that there are discussions whether it is enough. Obviously, when we saw the numbers from the World Bank and other speakers, we see that 75 billion crowns is really not enough. But again, in a historical context, it is the biggest aid and development program that we have ever had. And it also underlines the importance of this situation, and what is happening in Ukraine has the direct impact on our lives here in Norway and in Oslo. The main tasks for the program is, of course, to help Ukraine to protect its territory and population, and that's why we have the program divided into two parts. One is military, which is approximately 50%, and one for civic and humanitarian needs. I say approximately because it is up to revision every year when we decide on the budget, but at least now it is roughly 50-50. To maintain the social critical infrastructure in Ukraine so that as many Ukrainians can stay in Ukraine and help the country to sustain the territorial integrity and to have the wheels going on. The humanitarian part is, of course, to help reduce human suffering, and the last one is, which we are focusing very much on, is to rebuild. But sometimes, of course, we have to think, not sometimes, but every day in this program, we have to think of all these pillars at the same time. And when we talk with our partners, there are different programs in different regions in Ukraine. Someone on the west is working more long-term and building the buildings better, as we call, and someone is just repairing the windows so that people in the east can stay at their homes and then continue their life as much as it is possible. We have, in cooperation with many different departments and ministers, developed this white paper, which kind of summarizes and builds the framework around this program. You can have a look at it. We have also got another short version of this white paper in English. Thank you for mentioning our application-based scheme, which was announced last Friday. I encouraged all of the participants to have a look at it, and especially the Ukrainian civic society organizations. And this, coming back to what Olesa said, is that it is very important with local knowledge and historical background when you enter Ukraine or any other countries, actually, but very important to mobilize private investments. Again, it was said previously that without private sector, we cannot just rely on the public sector. That's why we have also, in partnership with the World Bank, with EBRD, with MIGA, developed the instruments that can empower the private sector to take more risks and to go into Ukraine and do the business already now. And the last one is institutional collaboration, which is also under development. This is the program that Ukraine is very much requesting, because as it said, it's not only about the physical infrastructure, it's about also all the social infrastructures and how the institutions take care of the local population. The key principles of this program is, first of all, flexibility, because as you see, there are a lot of challenges, and under these circumstances, we have to stay as much flexible as possible, because let's take, for example, if we start planning, and I mean, I have never been in so many planning meetings during my life as I did the last 5 months in NORAD. But when we plan something, and then there comes an airstrike and the Russians destroy the critical energy infrastructure, we have to allocate the money to repair the electricity in that city, because no matter what we do in the healthcare system or educational system, the people will leave that place if we don't repair that. So there is always a component of unpredictability and flexibility in everything we plan and do with our partners. Another one is Ukrainian ownership and needs. These are the central the central elements of this program, and we always coordinate everything that we do with Ukrainian counterparts. We cannot decide here in Oslo, in our Norad office, where the money will go and how it will be spent. We do receive a lot of good initiatives, good projects, and companies contact us with their products that the Ukrainian market may need, but we cannot decide here that we will spend money on these needs. We choose to send the money to our partners in Ukraine so that they decide what it should go on. There is a clear division, obviously, between the military part and the civic and society and social parts of the program. And the last but not least, which was also mentioned by previous speakers, is the control mechanisms. Ukraine is always named as one of the most corrupted countries in Europe. I personally think that it is unfair with this label being on us for such a long time. Yes, there was a lot of corruption 10, 15 years ago, but Ukraine did a lot of reforms to improve that. But again, it's a lot of money, and we have to know where they are going and what they are spent on. So good control mechanisms are central in every project we do. And that's why for this time, at this period, it was prioritized to focus on the partners that we know from before and that we know that they have good track record and the mechanisms in place so that we can be sure that the money is spent on the right manner. This is basically the number of partners. Not all of them are mentioned, but the main ones. And this is to illustrate that we are actually thinking the principle of building back better in everything we do. I will not repeat the previous speakers with a lot of the same that has been said previously, but just to come with some examples to show how challenging the situation is. To mention these 4 sectors: energy, housing, public services, and private sector. With some of the examples. 3.5 billion Norwegian crowns spent or allocated to EBRD to repair the critical energy infrastructure. At this very time, there is a meeting also between the Norwegian companies and Ukrainian Naftogaz, together with Ukrainian authorities, a couple of streets from here in Oslo, where they are also discussing the same issues. Now we are not even dependent on the money, but on the capacity on the market, because it is not kind of the equipment that you can go to the supermarket and take from the shelves. It takes time to develop and to produce this kind of things, and it is an example where we have to think also like now, but also in the long term. That's just to illustrate the complex of the situation and the program. Another one is housing. Again, there are different examples. World Bank Trust Fund, URTF, repairing the houses where it can be repaired. It is not very much about building back better, but just building back so that people can stay at their homes. And another example is Nefcor in Ivano-Frankivsk, where they built absolutely new house for several thousand people, internally displaced people, where we take all the principles of building back into that project. I will not spend that much on this. And then we have critical infrastructure, hospitals, communications, and again, it is very much dependent also on the private sector, because Ukraine cannot simply do it alone. I have been in conversations with the Ukrainian railways. They used to repair one railway bridge at a time in a peaceful time, because that's how much equipment they actually had, and that's how much you actually needed, because you had a plan to maintain all the infrastructure. But last year, when the delegation came to Norway, they had 32 bridges to repair already at that point. It means that they are dependent on the private companies also to get involved and to get these things done properly. Private sector, again, one of my favorite topics. MEGA war insurance. This is the instrument that we started last year, and it was already used by one of the companies in Ukraine building this industrial park. We use some of the Norwegian money to reduce the price of the war insurance so that the companies can get the price reduced to not be afraid to build the production facilities, and in this case the industrial park, which also will support the logistics, which is an important topic today. We have many more examples and projects, and as I said, there is more application-based schemes to be announced, so stay tuned and follow the NORAD on our web pages, and take contact. There is my email as well, so that's pretty much what I had to say. I didn't want to repeat a lot of what have been said before.
Thank you very much. You can stay a bit, just stay, and I'll ask you a couple of questions. Could you expand a bit on this funding scheme that you declared on Friday? We even thought perhaps you rushed to declare it before this webinar, but probably not. What type of criteria is involved for NGOs in Ukraine cooperating with Norwegian NGOs or other NGOs? Could you say a bit? And I know the deadline for application is the 19th of June, isn't it? So one needs to work quickly.
Yeah, basically we are looking for NGOs or organizations that has already track record in Ukraine, and those who has experience in dealing with big networks, so that we can share the grants with even smaller organizations in Ukraine, and especially with a focus on organizations working in the regions, because we see that what you addressed with Olesa, the amount of aid organizations in Ukraine is huge, but they are in big cities. That's why we want to look more in the regions. And the amount is for this time 70 million crowns, but we will see if it can be increased.
Excellent. Any questions to Anatoly? Yes, Diana. You must take a microphone, I think, otherwise it won't. No. Yes, I'm thinking about the audience.
Anatoly, I just have a question regarding. There seem to be some contradicting opinions about the DREAM project among our presenters. Do you have any thoughts or reflections on that?
We are also in dialogue with the Agency for Reconstruction, and I think that we everyone is impatient, but we have to wait and see. I believe that it is a very good idea, and we have to. We cannot create many mechanisms. We have to have one pipeline to have some sort of control. That's why I think DREAM is a very good start, so we should stick to that.
Thank you.
There's another question at the back there. She can have the microphone as well.
Anatoly, thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I'm just wondering regarding the role of Ukrainian universities in the country's rebuilding. Do you consider Ukrainian universities as actors of rebuilding processes? I'm wondering because actually, according to the national law, they are not like NGOs. Majority are state institutions or private initiatives. So it's interesting to know, have they any chances to participate in these projects and especially in this call that is announced? Thank you.
As far as I know, there is no restriction that it should be NGO. It says organization, so in my opinion, it should be qualified. But I work with the private sector and energy in Norad, but my colleagues will definitely answer. But universities has always been like the main pillar of everything, the economic development, and it should be definitely one of the main actors.
I perceive the criteria in the same way, but perhaps it's best to just check out. Thank you so much. That's excellent. We'll have a 5-minute break, not more than 5 minutes, so be back 6 minutes before 7, and then we'll have the panel conversation afterwards. Don't leave, because now everybody can say what they want afterwards. Okay, then we are back again. Welcome to this not very long, but hopefully meaningful conversation about what could be done in Ukraine ahead. In my mind, it's very much about the governance system, including civil society actors, and it's also about the short-term and the long-term aspects, and what a huge challenge we have ahead of us. Today we have we have 5 participants, 4 in the room and 1 outside, 3 from Ukraine, 1 from ftu.no and Architecture Without Borders, and 1 Norwegian from the Housing Federation. Hello, Lesia. Nice to have you here. You probably can't see the back of everybody else who's talking. You have heard Lesia before, and we expanded on some of the topics from some of the other contributors on the way. We also have Alexandra Dyneko. Hello. Assistant professor at the Faculty of Sociology in Kharkiv University, visiting researcher at OsloMet, and with several projects on Ukraine's refugees in Norway. I'll go through who you are first, and then I'll give the word freely afterwards. Christian Marius Styrkem. He's from the Norwegian Corporation Housing Federation. It's the biggest sort of cooperative housing provider in Norway, and perhaps even in Scandinavia, I would say. He has, amongst other things, I noticed, a PhD on EU NATO security strategies from LSE. Then we have Natalia Yeremeyeva. I almost managed. Who works at the Wergeland Center, but today is present as a member of the Ukraine Association in Norway. And she's worked with different things, but also education on human rights in civil societies in Ukraine. And then I should have mentioned beforehand, Alfonso Rengifo. Thank you. From Architects Without Borders, participated in different countries, working with reducing poverty, housing qualities, and local resource-based development, which perhaps may be quite an important aspect in this part of the debate. Have I forgotten anybody? No, I think we're all here. I think for the sake of the technicalities, I'd like Lesia to reflect first on what she's heard today. I don't want to structure the questions too much, but I would like you to reflect a bit on what have you heard and what have you thought could be something we take with us when we go ahead in our work with Ukraine. I understand very well that you get irritated by everybody talking too much. And of course, we understand the very serious aspect that if Ukraine doesn't win the war, things will be very different. But what are your reflections, Lesia? Are you there?
Thank you very much. And
yeah.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, excellent. Thank you again for the excellent debate. And I think there wasn't so much of I think we're more or less on the same page. I just think sometimes we feel the sense of urgency a little bit differently. I explained my personal take, and I'm sure everybody in the room understands, but we also understand that the world is manifold with multiple complex crises and situation. At the same time, I think it is really important that we keep the focus right. I will perhaps state the following about the different priorities that have been set, and there was a lot of discussion about who to prioritize, whether it's central government and international big institutions, or rather the local dimension of the reconstruction, the communities and the civil society. And I think it is not a question of either or, it's a question of how you combine sources. Sometimes I'm being asked about, how to balance between, government involvement and the central government having sometimes the upper hand, and at the same time you have local communities and a very vital NGO and civil society sector. Well, I think in Ukraine, when we're talking about systemic change and support to Ukraine, beyond the most important thing, which is, of course, defense, when it comes to reconstruction, you have to capacitate all of them. You have to capacitate the government. And I very much agree with everything that has been said by the speaker from the World Bank that spoke after me. About public wages, about different training necessities, about the sometimes inability to handle all the financial resources that are being streamed to Ukraine. So this is something that really needs to be prioritized now. The same is about helping civil service of Ukraine to be more inclusive, to enter into a culture of stakeholder consultations, as I was alluding to, since the Ukraine has inherited a certain weakness in terms of institutions and in terms of how it engages with citizens. It is exactly the central government that has to be capacitated and supported in order for this decentralization to really to happen, for the government to learn that certain functions have to be outsourced, have to be consulted about, have to be sometimes decentralized on the level of communities, and vice versa. Then you go on the level of the communities and you see again a very dire situation where we have understaffed city councils, where we have sometimes people who don't master, for example, the English language very well, and that has then quite a big impact on the ability to cooperate with international donors. although sometimes and very often the money is there, it's about how you reach it and whether you have the necessary knowledge and skills to do that. And then finally, you have also to capacitate the civil society, because as I've already mentioned, it very often bears the function that otherwise in other countries would have been done by either the central level or by local communities. And that's why it is, for my opinion, a challenge to capacitate all of the three, let's say, dimensions at the same time. But what is important is to keep in focus that they are not enemies, that they have to work in an interplay and really cooperate. And I think this is really crucial also for international actors to boost this cooperation rather than to try to play, not to play one against the other, but prioritize one against a certain group. And my final thing, which hasn't been mentioned too often today, but I'm a strong believer in twin cities. And I do believe that sometimes we talk about, Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction on very high political circles, but in the end, it is a village, it is a town, it is a city that is the backbone of the reconstruction in Ukraine. And sometimes what is much more effective, if a city somewhere in another country is entering into a very fruitful cooperation with the city here in Ukraine, as being basically a mentor, sometimes somebody who can lead the way to open up certain financial resources for cultural exchanges, for experience sharing, etc. And I invite Norwegian cities and communities also to be proactive in looking for Ukrainian counterparts to establish twin cities. I know that our discussion will be more lively, so I will perhaps stop here in order to allow more, questions and interactions for my colleagues.
Excellent, thank you. Is it Trondheim has already become twin city of one of the Ukrainian cities? Perhaps some of the other here can inform us about that. Let's try Natalia. What do you consider the main challenge in strengthening education and the general development of human rights in Ukraine?
Ellen, thanks a lot for this question, and thank you for having me. And it's not easy to answer this question. I would just refer to this division Lisa has made about the priorities and the necessity to keep the balance between them. And usually when we speak about education and human rights, people tend to say that this is not a priority now at the time of war. Well, I've heard it so many times that there are many other things that are much more urgent. At the same time, when we Ukrainians living abroad think that Ukrainians in Ukraine and what they fight for, this is exactly this dimension that many people say is not a priority. Ukrainians in Ukraine fight for democracy, democratic values, and this is the kind of society they would like to build. And one would say that it is just as important to support the development in this area. It also means it's just as important to support the vital governmental functions of Ukraine as a state. And I just do remember how at the very beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, just 2.5 weeks after 24th of February, Ukraine managed to restart the educational process. And when I start thinking about the fact that this brutal war Russia started against Ukraine is the most documented war probably in the history of the 20th century, then out of a sudden we start understanding why education for democracy and human rights are so important. Because this war is first of all about the deprivation of the million of people of their basic human rights to live in a safe, free society where nobody can challenge their right to be who they are, to have their identity, to speak the language they would like to speak, to be democratic, to practice the values they think they are important, that nobody has the right to take their lives or freedom or health just because They want to be volunteers, and they want to support the state where they were born or which they support. And this is, again, brings us back to the situation at the occupied territories of Ukraine. Many people tend to think about what's happening there very often in the, well, through the lens of justice, which is also extremely important, or documenting Russia's war crimes. But I would say that, well, turning back to the question you, Ellen, asked about the necessity of understanding human rights is the perspective. We probably should look at the situation, because what is happening at the occupied territories of Ukraine these days is not, I would say, so much about who has the control over the territory or like the land, but more about what's happening to people living on this territory. If they, as normal human beings, have the right to keep the human rights they're entitled to, just like any other person living in this world. And just taking a look at the Russia's war against Ukraine through this perspective brings us to a completely different understanding why human rights can be the focus and why exactly these organizations, these civil society organizations in Ukraine, working with these questions, should be supported. And, well, this is the current situation, but we also can very well, most probably face the situation with many other questions. They come in picture, and they also involve this human rights dimension. First of all, I think about these new challenges arising in the Ukrainian society, these completely new groups of people with their needs and rights in picture coming up, and these are people with special needs, lots of people who have lost their health because of this war. These are the internally displaced people. So I think that when we speak about the support to human rights and education for democracy and human rights, this is about taking all these questions into consideration. And it brings us to a completely new perspective of understanding how to help the country that really stands for these particular values. Well, one can obviously elaborate a lot more about this kind of things, but maybe we just pass further and see how we can interact and see how it plays with other participants.
Thank you. Alexandra, as visiting researcher at Oslo Met, and with your background as professor at the Faculty of Sociology in Kharkiv, and your general knowledge about life in Ukraine, what are your reflections after you've heard different presentations today?
Yes, thank you for this question and for the invitation. Actually, this weekend I talked with local people who live now in Slovyansk, and this is a city just near the front line. And we talk about their daily life and what they are doing every day. And they told me that, Alexandra, we are very active here, but all of the non-governmental organizations that have been working here before the full-scale invasion, they moved from Slovyansk and now they work in other regions of Ukraine. And these people, and in this regard, I appreciate this Nansen program approach to support local organizations. And I also would like to make a special focus on the regions that are located near the front line, because Alexander talked today about regional imbalances, considering infrastructural capacities in Ukraine. And as a sociologist, I may conclude that there are also regional imbalances when it comes to social issues, to everyday life, to life experiences. And we cannot compare the life that people have, for example, in western or central parts of Ukraine, with less danger to their life and security, and the lifestyle and life experiences of those who are still living in the front line, and the main desire is just to survive every single day. So I think that it's extremely important, and it's very strategical both for Ukraine and international community to allocate funds towards those regions who are in the most need now, and this is frontline regions of Ukraine. Coming with some propositions regarding the actual projects and actual topics, for sure we need to rely on the local needs. And it's quite obvious that these needs coming from the place where people can live and the place where they can work. So all of the project in the sphere of housing, in the sphere of labor market, and different startups, it's very relevant and very urgent if we would like to just to maintain everyday life in the border regions of Ukraine. I also would like to say that people in the border regions, they experience a necessity to support the army in a very strong sense. And I think that some of the civic projects that can enhance these local capacities, that can unite people on the local areas in their desire to support army, maybe it can be some local hubs or some special places where people can meet and can do something together. It's also very important potential, not only just to support our army because it's the first priority, but also to consolidate local communities and to maintain social cohesion in Ukraine. This is a strategical issue. I also need to mention that quite challenging issue in all of the Ukrainian regions now, this is the lack of trust toward local authority and national authorities. And in this regard, I may say that it's not something that is maybe tragical or like something that we cannot influence on. I think that it is caused by the martial law when local authorities are very limited with their capacities to be transparent. And I think that in this regard, we also need to support local journalists who work in these frontline regions, as they can build some bridges between local authorities and local communities, just to help local authorities to make their activities more transparent in the possible ways, because it also will help to elaborate and increase institutional trust in Ukraine. And as we know, this is also the core of social cohesion. I also need to mention that talking with people from the front line, a lot of them mentioned that the quality of education for their children and the challenges with education is a very crucial issue for them. So in this regard, I think that all of the projects that are working with the educational capacities and creating some new opportunities for Ukrainian children living in the war could be also very useful topic to be developed and invest in. And maybe yes. And just one small thing at the end, I think that also the role of Ukrainian universities should be considered in this regard, because all of the rebuilding processes, they need to be relied on a research-based approach, beginning from estimations and concluding with the expertise and analyzing of social risks. And I think that in this regard, the role of Ukrainian academia and Ukrainian universities should also be used to be supported. Thank you.
Excellent. And of course, it's interesting that NORAD's funding now on Friday states explicitly that it should be used for the regions, not for the bigger cities. So perhaps there are people in this room that want to explore that, or for instance, Lesia with rice and so on. Christian Marius, Obos has been a very important actor in Norwegian history, and after the Second World War, the central government had a very sort of strong and quite hard-handed policy of rebuilding the north of Norway. And one placed dwellings, which, for instance, the Sami people didn't know how to use a bathtub. They used it for you know, when you kill a reindeer and you cut it into pieces, they used the bathtub for that. And people were forced not to come back and so on. It was quite a hard-handed policy. On the other hand, it's important to have a strong central government policy when you have large-scale destructions like you have in a war. Obos has become a very important federal housing association, and NBBL that you represent, Obos, is the Oslo-based part of it. What would you say is the big learning points from the history of Obos that Ukraine could take with it into the next phase?
Well, let me start by saying I should be very careful to define what should be picked up in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I have no proper understanding, except from being on vacation there in '95. But I would like to mention one of the points emphasized this afternoon, which was actually very productive. Affordable housing is part of the social infrastructure. That is the key point emphasized today. And I understand there are challenges in Ukraine that has not been addressed before. That is not likely to be easily addressed in the years to come. But we have to understand that as Ukraine is winning the war and entering, hopefully, the European Union, housing is one key to building the welfare state, to find ways to have a very productive economy that can compete on the international market. But without housing, without regulating housing, without making housing affordable, most other things can fall apart. So that's my key finding today. I have a few comments about what could be done. So if you tempt me, I will say a few things. Well, without being an expert, I have still identified some things lacking. Ownership to land has to be regulated, and it has to be distributed based on where would you like to take your society, not on who's bidding most, not on who's first in line, but on what kind of development would that specific society like to have. Secondly, I understand, without knowing too many details, there is a lack of legal regulation of the rental market, the mortgage market, consumer protection for ownership is lacking too, and the role of local municipalities has to be defined, it has to be financed, but everything comes down to the home ownership. And I picked up that about 75% of all flats or homes are not managed. No one is taking care of anything except from the stairs, and that's each and everyone's separate flat. And I think what we might provide that is useful is the way to find a common ownership of property. We have had since the last days almost of the Second World War, we have had a principle of private ownership, but we take care of the flats and the buildings together. And we have a separate law. So we have almost 80 years of experience. We are happy to share. We don't plan to export because nothing can be exported. It's a very Norwegian, Scandinavian system, but still there might be inspiration to find. And we are here to learn and maybe help.
Yes, because the collective housing regime in Norway, which is at the moment, of course, the market functions as markets do. Can I say
something? Because there might be many Ukrainians watching.
Yeah.
And if you say collective, what do Ukrainians think? Do you think it's a good idea? Did you have too much collectivism during Soviet times? I would not like to use the phrase collective in this context. No, not at all. It all comes down to, if you live in a block of flats, you have to have a housing management strategy. You have to find out what to do together, to finance, to find someone to help you. If that's collective to someone, fine with me, but it's actually taking care of your private property. That's what it all comes down to.
Thank you for the input on perhaps pedagogical wrong word, but I still think it's as opposed to pure private ownership, where you buy a piece of flat and there is less regulation as to the rules or how you can use it than if you have what I call the collective.
There is no such thing as an unregulated market.
Could I please finish now?
I just wanted to mention that because you have to find a legal framework for private ownership to operate in this specific country.
if you call it co-private ownership, that's fine with me.
Yeah.
The point is that it's a system where you can buy a membership, and after some time you will be able to buy a flat partially or wholly, and you can pay a bit more of the rent, and then as the years pass you can own the apartment. And what it has proven quite well functioning for is the maintenance of the housing stock, which of course is what I gather from Ukraine that you perhaps need a model for. When it comes to the land ownership, of course, if the task is so huge, but perhaps the task is also something one should approach on a smaller scale, because if one could have some piloting of improvable area programs or whatever, perhaps it would be possible to develop some legal framework that could test out alternatives to what you have. Not saying which ones that should actually be. Okay, we should get on to Alfonso, Architects Without Borders, because now we sort of moved from democracy down to social cohesion and then formal housing strategies. What would you say is the most important thing from this session?
We heard a lot about the big support, big infrastructure, but us here in Architects Without Borders, we are a small non-profit organization here in Norway. We work mainly with some people working for us and some volunteers, Norwegian architects. But we found then there's a potential of professional Ukrainians that have moved here. And we have get in touch with NAV and taking some of these professionals to help us with the projects back in their own land. So instead of, and we tried that approach in most of our projects. We are architects, but we don't know, we're not the all-knowing architects that comes, here's your building, thank you very much, now we leave. We use the local knowledge, and in this case with the Ukrainian project, we have a few Ukrainian projects. We're using these professionals that are taking refuge here in Norway, and they work back in these projects. So we're empowering them, which in a lot of cases, they end up working in a kindergarten or in a supermarket because of the language barrier or because that's the path they're put into. But I just want to say that there's such an untapped potential market of Ukrainian professionals that can be used in different companies, engineers, economy, everything. If then they get in touch with these governmental programs. For the first year, it's sponsored by the government. They learn the language, they use the practice part-time, but then it empowers them to get better assimilation with the Norwegian society and to work, in our case, to work back in projects that will help Ukrainian. I heard today about all the different programs and all the different possibility of sponsorship that we hope we can get in touch with. But this will help this regrowth, not just from the inside, but from the outside, using Ukrainians.
May I ask you, does Architects Without Borders also cooperate with different NGOs in Ukraine?
Yes, we have different from individuals that are in the ground and they want to make a change, that get in touch with us, to different organizations that got in touch with a Norwegian NGO, and the Norwegian NGO got in touch with us to build a specific project over there. And another case, one of Ukrainians people, they got in touch with a professional there that wants to help an organization to rebuild a school, after school activity for kids. So it's not the big organizations, it's small organizations and individual people that get in touch with us, so we can give back to them.
Thank you. Helge, have you got a question on the slider?
I think at this point of time, I think the most important question is this meeting being recorded?
Yes, it is.
And if so, where to find it?
We'll talk to Tekna about that afterwards. I'm sure Tekna would share it with everybody, and if not, we can share it on the Habitat Norway website, can't we?
I got another question, which I guess you cannot answer now, but do you fear that corruption will be a big issue in this reconstruction, time of reconstruction, and are there strategies, adopted strategies to combat corruption in Ukraine. And the third question was, I'm an architect, I would like to be involved. Where do I turn?
To me. Yes.
Great.
Okay.
About the corruption, I think we also were told earlier today that this digitalization has helped a lot, but I'm sure it's still a challenge. Christian?
When it comes to corruption, I think we should be sober, we should be aware, and everyone who enters the market commercially, or if it's a business to business or civil to civil society cooperation, well, we have to be looking carefully about who we're working with. So I wouldn't caution anyone not to enter Ukraine, but you have to find your own checklist. And there are lots of places to look to find checklists, and you can do cross-checking on partners. So, of course, you shouldn't say, no, we don't go there.
Yeah, I just need to add that there is a common sense in Ukraine now that corruption is much worse than collaboration with the enemy in Ukraine. And in this regard, I think that we need to support Ukrainian people and to include anti-corruption mechanisms in all of the programs that are addressed to Ukraine now.
And just to sum up what both of my colleagues mentioned here, and the fantastic example Alfonso came up with about the role of Ukrainian refugees, this is also can be looked at as an anti-corruption measure, because Ukrainians living here, being the second largest immigrant group now in Norway, learning from the colleagues in Norway, not only in architecture, but in other spheres. Also, Lisa's example of the Twin Cities. This is also where Ukrainian refugees can be involved actively. They can become the ambassadors, really. And the Ukrainian Association in Norway is the biggest and the oldest diaspora organization. We advocate all the time that Ukrainians, these newcomers, should be used to as much as to the biggest, to all the potential they have, so that they take with them all this knowledge and experience to fight corruption, to build a democratic society back in Ukraine. This is another type of investment Norway can make into Ukraine in a completely different, indirect way. And so just let's learn from each other and use the resources we have.
I think that was a very good closing off commentary, and I'm sure people will go into due diligence procurement procedures when they want to cooperate both ways. It doesn't go only to Ukraine, it may as well go back to Norway. So thank you very much for coming. We will hopefully meet again later after the summer holidays, when we'll talk about the city, housing and land property details a bit more than we have done today. But I think this has been quite a good sort of broadening out of our knowledge of what the situation is like. So thank you very much to the panelists and to everybody else. Does